December 18, 1944. Highway N23, 3 miles south of Malmedy, Belgium. Technical Sergeant Raymond J. Hollister raised his gloved hand as the convoy approached his checkpoint through the morning fog. 11 trucks carrying ammunition toward the front. Critical supplies for units barely holding against the massive German offensive that had erupted 2 days earlier. Hollister had been running this checkpoint for 18 hours straight. His eyes burned from fatigue and cold. But something about the lead vehicle made him step into the road with more authority than usual. The convoy ground to a halt. An American captain climbed from the passenger seat of the first truck, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos consuming the Ardennes forest. He carried himself with the confidence of an officer accustomed to being obeyed without question. He approached Hollister with paperwork already extended, his breath visible in the frozen air. Captain James Mitchell, 3rd Armored Division. We've got munitions urgently needed at the front. Every minute counts, Sergeant. Hollister had seen hundreds of officers pass through his checkpoint in recent days. Most were frustrated by delays, angry at being questioned by enlisted men, desperate to reach units fighting for survival. This captain seemed different. Too composed. Too clean. Too confident for a man whose division was supposedly locked in desperate combat 15 miles north. What Raymond Hollister didn't know was that he was facing Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter, one of Otto Skorzeny's most talented infiltrators. A man who had spent 6 months in America before the war, studying at Columbia University. A man who spoke English without accent, who understood American culture deeply enough to fool trained interrogators. A man who had successfully passed through 4 American checkpoints in the previous 24 hours, gathering intelligence on troop dispositions, misdirecting supply convoys, spreading rumors of breakthroughs that hadn't occurred. Richter represented everything Operation Greif hoped to achieve. He wasn't a desperate volunteer with minimal English force to fake diarrhea if questioned. He was a professional intelligence officer who could think in English, dream in English, improvise in English. The operations architects believed men like Richter could operate behind American lines for weeks, creating chaos that conventional forces never could. But Klaus Richter had one vulnerability he didn't know existed. He had left America in August 1939, before war broke out in Europe. His knowledge of American culture froze at that moment. The 6 years since had changed America in ways no amount of studying could replicate. Popular culture had shifted. New phrases had entered the language. And Technical Sergeant Raymond J. Hollister, a mill worker from Pittsburgh who had never traveled outside Pennsylvania before the Army sent him to Europe, possessed cultural knowledge that Klaus Richter, despite his Columbia degree, simply could not have. The mathematics of detection were being written not in sophisticated counterintelligence analysis, but in the natural evolution of language and culture that occurs in every society, invisible to those observing from outside, impossible to anticipate in advance. 60 days earlier, in late October 1944, Adolf Hitler had summoned SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny to his headquarters deep in East Prussia. Hitler presented Skorzeny with orders for the most audacious special operation of the war. German forces would launch a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, driving toward Antwerp, splitting the American and British armies. Success depended on speed. Panzers needed to reach the Meuse River before Allied forces could organize effective defense. Bridges had to be captured intact. Skorzeny would form a special brigade whose mission was to seize those bridges by any means necessary. Hitler made clear that any means included wearing American uniforms, speaking English, and operating deep behind enemy lines disguised as American soldiers. Skorzeny immediately understood the implications. The Hague Convention was explicit. Combatants captured in enemy uniform could be executed as spies. But Hitler's orders were absolute. Skorzeny began recruiting. He needed English speakers. Fluent, native-quality English speakers. The recruiting call went out across the German military. Volunteers were promised exciting duty, significance beyond normal military service, perhaps even recognition from the Führer himself. What they weren't told until after arrival was that they would be wearing enemy uniforms, violating international law, risking execution if captured. Nearly 2,500 men eventually assembled at the training camp established at Greifenweiler in Bavaria. The quality varied catastrophically. A handful, perhaps 10 men, spoke English perfectly. Men like Klaus Richter who had lived in America or Britain for extended periods. Another 30 or 40 spoke well enough to pass casual conversation. The vast majority possessed only textbook English, barely functional for their assigned missions. Klaus Richter arrived at Greifenweiler in early November. Unlike most volunteers, he knew exactly what he had signed up for. He had been hand-selected by Skorzeny personally after intelligence officers reviewed his file. American university education. Perfect English. Deep knowledge of American customs and culture. Richter was exactly the asset Operation Greif needed. Training began immediately. The most talented English speakers formed special teams designated for the most sensitive missions. They would infiltrate deepest, operate longest, gather the most critical intelligence. Richter's team consisted of 5 men, all with extended experience in English-speaking countries. They studied American military organization, memorized unit insignias and rank structures, practiced radio procedures, learned to drive American vehicles. But mostly they practiced being American. Walking like Americans. Standing like Americans. Smoking cigarettes the way Americans smoked. Chewing gum constantly as Americans did. Using American slang naturally in conversation. Creating the thousands of tiny behavioral patterns that mark cultural identity more reliably than any password. They watched American movies captured from occupied territories. They listened to recordings of American radio broadcasts. They interviewed American prisoners at POW camps near Kustrin, engaging in casual conversation about sports, about movies, about life back home. The prisoners, lonely and bored, talked freely about baseball pennant races and Hollywood gossip and regional differences between states. Richter excelled at all of it. He had authentic memories of America to draw upon. He remembered attending Yankees games at Yankee Stadium. He remembered the layout of Manhattan neighborhoods. He remembered the taste of authentic American hot dogs and the sound of subway trains and the particular way New York taxi drivers cursed in traffic. His knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was lived experience. What Richter couldn't know was that lived experience had an expiration date. Culture doesn't stand still. The America he had known in 1939 was not the America fighting in Europe in December 1944. 6 years of war had changed things. New phrases had entered the language. Popular culture had shifted. Songs he had never heard were now universally known. Movies he had never seen were referenced constantly. Slang evolved. His knowledge, though genuine and deep, was frozen in 1939. On December 14, Panzer Brigade 150 assembled near Bad Münstereifel. On December 16, before dawn, more than 200,000 German troops attacked through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Richter's team infiltrated during the first hours of chaos. Wearing captured American uniforms. Driving a captured jeep with proper markings. Carrying authentic American weapons and identification papers. For the first 24 hours, they operated successfully. They passed through checkpoints by presenting perfect paperwork and speaking confident English. They gathered intelligence on American positions. They misdirected 2 supply convoys by giving false directions to confused American truck drivers. They cut telephone lines at 3 locations. They spread rumors of German breakthrough units reaching towns they hadn't actually reached. Small actions, but multiplied across dozens of similar teams, creating cumulative chaos that hampered American response to the offensive. On the morning of December 18, Richter's team acquired 11 trucks loaded with ammunition abandoned by an American unit during hurried withdrawal. Richter made a command decision. Rather than destroying the trucks, they would drive the convoy toward German lines, delivering critically needed munitions to advancing panzers. It required passing through American-controlled territory, through checkpoints, past suspicious guards. But they had done it before. Richter's confidence was high. Technical Sergeant Raymond J. Hollister had been stationed at his checkpoint on Highway N-23 since the offensive began. He had processed hundreds of vehicles. Mostly retreating units, refugees from overrun positions, stragglers separated from parent formations. Also reinforcements moving forward, supply convoys heading toward the fighting, military police attempting to organize the chaos. Hollister's orders were clear. Stop everything. Check identification. Ask questions. Report suspicious behavior immediately. By December 18, word had spread through the American rear areas about German infiltrators. Captured prisoners had admitted wearing American uniforms. One prisoner had made wild claims about plans to assassinate General Eisenhower. Nobody knew which rumors were true. Military police had been instructed to interrogate everyone, using questions designed to expose Germans pretending to be Americans. What team won the World Series? What is the capital of Illinois? Who is Betty Grable married to? The questions were improvised, chaotic, often absurd. Many genuine American soldiers couldn't answer them. But the system caught infiltrators whose training hadn't covered baseball statistics or Hollywood gossip. It caught men who spoke good English but didn't know that Chicago had 2 baseball teams. It caught educated Germans who knew American history but not American popular culture. When Captain Mitchell approached his checkpoint, Hollister's instincts activated. Something felt wrong. The captain's uniform was too clean. His confidence seemed forced. His paperwork was too perfect. Hollister had learned to trust those instincts during 18 months of military police duty. He decided to ask questions beyond standard protocol. Where's the 3rd Armored currently positioned, Captain? Engaged near Malmedy, Sergeant. We're hauling ammunition from depot at Verviers to forward positions. The answer was plausible. Geography was correct. Units mentioned were accurate. But Hollister noticed Mitchell pronounced Malmedy with French precision. Most American soldiers butchered Belgian place names. They said Malmedy, anglicizing it completely. Mitchell's pronunciation was too correct. Long way from depot to front, sir. You boys must have been driving all night. Since midnight, Sergeant. These supplies are urgently needed. We're burning daylight. Understand completely, Captain. Just got to ask a few quick questions. Standard procedure since the infiltrators got caught. Richter maintained relaxed posture. He had anticipated interrogation. He had answers prepared for common questions. Baseball. Movie stars. State capitals. Geography. He was ready. Who won the World Series this year, Captain? Cardinals beat Browns, 4-2. All St. Louis series. The answer was perfect. Accurate. Delivered with appropriate confidence. Richter had studied extensively. The 1944 World Series had been unusual, both teams from the same city. Easy to remember. He relaxed slightly. The questions were as simple as briefings had indicated. Hollister nodded. Good answer. But something still felt wrong. He decided to try something different. Not a factual question from the standard list. Something more cultural. Something that required actually living in America during the past year. Must have been frustrating, missing the series while you're over here. You catch any of the games on Armed Forces radio before the offensive started? It was a trap Richter couldn't see. Armed Forces radio had broadcast all 6 World Series games with detailed commentary. Every American soldier in Europe had heard them or heard other soldiers discussing them. The broadcasts had been a brief connection to home. Soldiers talked about specific plays, specific moments, specific announcer calls. It was shared cultural experience, recent and vivid. Unfortunately no, Sergeant. We were forward deployed during the broadcasts, couldn't get signal. Plausible answer. Richter had covered himself. But Hollister pressed further. Shame. That finish in Game 6 was something else. When Donnelly made that call in the 9th, guys in my tent went absolutely crazy. Hollister was lying. There had been no player named Donnelly involved in any memorable play in Game 6. He was testing whether Mitchell would correct him or agree with a false statement. An American who had actually heard the broadcasts or discussed them with other soldiers would know the name was wrong. Someone pretending to knowledge they didn't possess might simply agree. Absolutely, Richter said. Historic moment. Hollister's hand moved to his holstered pistol. Step away from the vehicle, Captain. Keep your hands visible. Richter understood immediately. The question had been a trap. He had failed a test he didn't know he was taking. His mind raced through options. He was 500 meters from American headquarters. Surrounded by American troops. His team in the trucks behind couldn't help without exposing themselves. Fighting meant certain death. There a problem, Sergeant? There was no Donnelly, sir. And nothing particularly historic about Game 6 finish. Cardinals won easily. Now step away from the vehicle with your hands where I can see them. For 3 seconds, Richter calculated whether he could draw his concealed Walther pistol before Hollister drew his M1911. He concluded he could not. He raised his hands slowly. Behind him, the truck drivers were climbing from their vehicles, also raising hands. They understood their mission had ended. Within 10 minutes, military police had Richter and his 4 team members in custody. Search revealed German uniforms beneath American olive drab. Walther pistols instead of standard-issue Colts. Identity papers that were expertly forged but contained small errors visible under detailed examination. Maps marked with German tactical symbols. Radio codes. Hollister filed his report. 5 German infiltrators captured, 11 trucks full of ammunition secured, intelligence materials confiscated. His commanding officer commended him. Headquarters requested he document his interrogation technique. The detail about false statement testing was added to military police training guidelines. Klaus Richter was transferred to prisoner holding facility near Eupen. During interrogation over the next 2 days, he provided detailed information about Operation Greif. He explained the training, the objectives, the tactics. He identified other team members who might still be operating behind American lines. He confirmed that small teams had successfully infiltrated deep into American-controlled territory. Interrogators were impressed by his English fluency and cultural knowledge. He discussed American politics intelligently, referenced American literature and history, demonstrated understanding of regional differences between American states. He was clearly educated and sophisticated. Under different circumstances, interrogators noted, he might have operated undetected for weeks. But he had made one fatal error. He had agreed with a false statement rather than correcting it. That single mistake, born from incomplete knowledge of recent events he couldn't possibly have experienced, had exposed him. On December 20th, Richter and his 4 team members faced military tribunal. The charges were clear. Violation of the laws of war by wearing enemy uniforms while conducting military operations behind enemy lines. The evidence was overwhelming. They had been captured in American uniforms. They admitted being German soldiers. They acknowledged their mission. The legal situation admitted no ambiguity. Article 23 of the Hague Convention explicitly forbade improper use of enemy uniform. Soldiers captured while wearing enemy uniform during military operations could be treated as spies rather than prisoners of war. The tribunal had no discretion. The verdict was predetermined by international law. All 5 were convicted. All 5 were sentenced to death by firing squad. The sentences were reviewed by higher command and approved. Execution was scheduled for December 23, 2 days before Christmas. Klaus Richter spent his final 3 days writing letters. To his mother in Hamburg. To his younger sister studying medicine in Berlin. To his former professors at German universities. He wrote about duty and honor. He wrote that he had followed orders and served his country as officers were expected to serve. He expressed no regret for his actions. He accepted his fate as consequence of decisions freely made. On the morning of December 23, Richter and his 4 team members were transported to the execution site. American military police prepared the location according to regulations. 5 posts were erected. Medical officer Captain James Richardson examined each prisoner to confirm identity and physical condition for execution. The 5 Germans stood straight. They declined blindfolds. Richter spoke briefly to the American Protestant chaplain who offered final prayers, thanking him for his kindness. When asked if he had final words, Richter said only, "We did our duty. History will judge whether it mattered." The firing squad consisted of 12 military policemen. Not executioners by training or preference. Soldiers following lawful orders under wartime conditions. They formed line at prescribed distance. Officers' verified rifles were loaded and ready. The command was given. 5 rifles fired simultaneously. Klaus Richter died instantly. His 4 team members likewise. Medical officer confirmed deaths. Bodies were removed, prepared for burial. Within hours they were interred at temporary military cemetery near Eupen. Eventually they would be transferred to Henri Chapelle American Cemetery before final relocation to German Military Cemetery at Lommel, Belgium, where they rest today. Raymond J. Hollister returned to his checkpoint and continued his duties. He processed hundreds more vehicles over the following weeks. He asked his questions, checked paperwork, sent soldiers forward. When the Battle of the Bulge finally ended in late January 1945, Hollister's checkpoint closed. He was reassigned to different duties. Years later, after the war, Hollister rarely discussed the capture. When asked, he would say only that he had done his job as trained. The execution troubled him. Not because the men hadn't violated the law. They clearly had. But because they were professional soldiers following orders, not criminals. The moral complexity haunted him occasionally during quiet moments of his long life. He died in 1987 at age 71 in Pittsburgh, surrounded by family. His obituary mentioned military service but not the specific capture. His family knew few details. He had been a military policeman during the war. He had served honorably. That was enough. Klaus Richter's family learned of his death through Red Cross notifications in early 1945. His mother received his final letter months later through neutral channels. She kept it until her own death in 1963. His sister survived the war, completed medical school, practiced as physician in West Germany for 40 years. She occasionally visited his grave at Lommel. She never blamed Americans for the execution. Her brother had known the risks. Operation Greif failed in its tactical objectives. No bridges were captured intact. The rapid breakthrough never materialized. German forces never reached the Meuse River with enough strength to exploit success. American defenses, though surprised initially, held at critical points. By December 22, the offensive had stalled. By early January, Allied counterattacks were pushing German forces back. But the psychological impact of Operation Greif vastly exceeded its tactical results. Thousands of American soldiers spent weeks suspecting infiltrators might be anywhere. Checkpoint delays slowed reinforcement movements during critical days. Command decisions were complicated by uncertainty about enemy capabilities. The paranoia affected operations far beyond what the actual infiltrators accomplished. The checkpoint interrogations became legendary. The improvised questions about baseball and movies and state capitals entered military folklore. The system, chaotic and often absurd, nevertheless worked. It caught infiltrators by testing cultural knowledge that couldn't be taught quickly. It demonstrated that identity involves more than language or documents. Identity involves shared experience, accumulated naturally over years, impossible to replicate in weeks of training. Technical Sergeant Hollister's technique of false statement testing proved particularly effective. Rather than asking factual questions that Germans might have studied, he made false claims to see if subjects would correct him or agree. Americans with genuine knowledge would recognize errors. Germans with incomplete knowledge might accept false information rather than risk exposure by disagreeing. The technique was incorporated into interrogation training. It influenced counterintelligence methodology for decades. Modern security services still use variations when attempting to identify false identities. The principle remains valid. Authentic cultural fluency reveals itself in subtle ways that studied knowledge cannot replicate. Otto Skorzeny faced trial in 1947 for ordering Operation Greif. He was acquitted after arguing his orders prohibited fighting while wearing enemy uniforms. His men were to remove American uniforms before engaging in actual combat. The tribunal accepted the distinction between using uniforms for infiltration versus using them during fighting. 17 of Skorzeny's men had been executed during the battle. Skorzeny walked free after trial. The apparent injustice troubled many. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945. American casualties exceeded 80,000. German casualties were similar. Hitler had gambled everything on the offensive and lost. Germany never again mounted major offensive operations in the West. The war would end 4 months later with German unconditional surrender. The graves at Lommel today hold more than 39,000 German war dead from World War II. They include soldiers killed in conventional combat and those executed after military tribunals. The cemetery makes no distinction. All are German military dead. Klaus Richter's grave stands among them, marked with his name, rank, and death date. Visitors occasionally stop, read the inscription, wonder about the story behind one life among thousands. Raymond Hollister's checkpoint on Highway N-23 no longer exists. The road has been rebuilt multiple times. Modern traffic flows past without awareness that once, on frozen December mornings, American soldiers stood there asking questions about baseball to determine who lived and who died. The history is invisible to travelers. But the lessons remain relevant. Cultural identity serves as security tool when properly understood. Special operations can create disproportionate psychological impact. But they cannot substitute for conventional military success. The laws of war matter, though their application involves complexity and judgment. And the human cost of war extends beyond battlefield casualties to include those executed after proper legal process for violations of established law. Klaus Richter was 29 years old at execution. Educated, intelligent, capable. He had made choices that led to a frozen morning in Belgium, to a post, to rifles. He faced death with dignity, accepting consequences of his decisions. Whether his mission was worth his life remains question without satisfying answer. He believed he was serving his country honorably. The tribunal judged he had violated the laws of war. Both conclusions carried weight. The intersection of duty, law, morality, and consequence defines warfare's tragic complexity. Good men on both sides faced impossible choices. Some chose infiltration and deception. Some chose execution of captured enemies. All believed they were following legitimate orders and serving honorable causes. History judges their actions through multiple lenses, finding no simple conclusions. Operation Greif demonstrated that psychological warfare and deception can force multiply beyond direct tactical results. It demonstrated that cultural knowledge accumulated through lived experience cannot be quickly replicated. It demonstrated that special operations require conventional military success to achieve strategic objectives. And it demonstrated that the laws of war, however complex their application, serve necessary function in limiting warfare's inherent brutality. 5 men died before firing squads on December 23, 1944. 17 total Operation Greif participants were executed during the battle. They rest today in maintained cemeteries, their graves marked and honored as war dead. They were not monsters. They were soldiers who accepted dangerous missions and paid ultimate price when captured. Technical Sergeant Raymond J. Hollister returned home after the war, worked in steel mills, raised family, lived quiet unremarkable life except for one morning when his instincts and improvisational interrogation technique exposed enemy infiltrators. He received commendation. He filed report. He returned to duty. 70 years later, the details are recorded in military archives, accessible to researchers, largely forgotten by broader public. December 1944 in the Ardennes. Where Americans learned that sometimes the sharpest weapon is a question, the strongest defense is cultural knowledge, and the hardest burden is executing enemies who were simply following orders. The frost has long since melted. The checkpoints are gone. The men who stood on both sides have passed into history. But the lessons endure, encoded in military doctrine, studied in war colleges, relevant as long as warfare continues and identity remains tool of both deception and detection.